My husband, Robert, and I were not the kind of people who made a lot of noise. We were the quiet couple in the neighborhood, the ones who kept our lawn meticulously trimmed, who waved from the porch swing, who baked a little too much and gave the rest to the mailman. We were the people who, after 40 years of marriage, had a predictable routine: coffee on the porch at dawn, dinner at 6, an hour of reading on the sofa before bed. At 65 years old, I had come to cherish this predictability. It was a comfort, a testament to a life well lived and a partnership forged in steel. Or so I thought. My name is Margaret, and I am 65 years old. Robert is 67. We had built a life, brick by brick, not of lavishness or spectacle, but of unwavering mutual support. Our house, a charming two-story colonial nestled on a quiet street in a suburb of Pittsburgh, was a monument to our decades together. The home, with its peeling paint on the back porch railing and the rose bushes I'd nurtured for 20 years, was not just a place to live, it was an extension of our souls. It was in this house that we had raised our only child, a son named Daniel. Daniel, now 38, was a kind, albeit distant man. He lived in another state, consumed by his own career and family life, and our relationship had slowly devolved into a series of perfunctory phone calls and holiday cards. He was not a bad son. He was simply a busy man who had, perhaps, forgotten how to be present. I had always been the quiet strength in our family. While Robert worked as a successful architect, a man of blueprints and bold ideas, I was the one who managed the household, who tended to the garden, and who balanced our accounts with the precision of a seasoned accountant. Our life was a well-oiled machine, and I, in my quiet way, was the engineer. Robert, in his role as the visionary, was always full of grand pronouncements. "Our golden years are a reward, Margaret," he would say, "for a lifetime of hard work. We will travel. We will see the world." I had always smiled, nodding along, but privately, I had my doubts. Our finances, while comfortable, were not extravagant. We had our home, our pensions, our carefully managed savings, but a lifetime of international travel was a pipe dream, not a reality. The first crack in my idyllic world appeared subtly, like a hairline fracture in a teacup. It was a new habit of Robert's, a late-night stroll. "Fresh air helps me think, Margaret," he would explain, a new lightness to his voice I had not heard in years. "My mind feels alive again, full of new ideas." I, in my naivety, was happy for him. The man I had loved for so long had been burdened by the mundane routine of our quiet life, and now he had found a new source of inspiration. I was so wrapped up in my own quiet joy for him that I failed to notice the subtle changes: the new, more expensive clothes, the faint, unfamiliar scent of a floral perfume on his shirt, the furtive glances at his phone when a text notification would chime. I was a fool, a woman so accustomed to a man's honesty that I failed to notice a lie when it was presented to me on a silver platter. Then came the grand announcement. One Thursday evening, Robert came home with a bottle of champagne, a beverage we reserved for weddings and anniversaries. He was beaming, a boyish excitement in his eyes. "Margaret," he began, his voice quivering with anticipation, "I have big news. I have found my muse." My heart, a delicate bird, fluttered in my chest. A muse? After all these years? It sounded so romantic, so full of possibilities. "Who is she, Robert?" I asked, a genuine smile on my lips. "Where is she?" He took my hand and looked at me, his eyes filled with a strange, unnerving mix of exhilaration and shame. "Her name is Clarissa," he said, the name a sweet melody on his tongue. "She is a young architect, a prodigy, and we are working on a project together." My smile faltered, a chill seeping into the room. A young architect. He had said that as if it were a simple, innocent detail. But there was a look in his eyes that was far from innocent. He was a man with a confession, but not the confession I would have expected. "She is also my partner," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I have never been so happy. I am leaving you, Margaret." The world as I knew it, the world I had painstakingly built over 40 years, collapsed in a single, devastating moment. The silence that followed his words was a deafening roar. My hands, which had so recently balanced our accounts and nurtured our garden, now hung lifelessly at my sides. I stared at him, this man who was both a stranger and the only person I had ever truly known. The champagne bottle on the counter, a symbol of celebration, now seemed a grotesque mockery of my pain. A partner, I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. A prodigy? A muse? My voice rose with each repetition, a rising tide of disbelief and fury. She's 25, Margaret, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any attempt at a genuine apology. He had said her age as if it were a simple, innocuous fact, a detail as mundane as the color of the walls in his new apartment. He had said her age as if it were not the final, cruel nail in the coffin of my marriage. I didn't cry. Not then. I was in a state of shock, a quiet, protective numbness that had settled over me like a heavy shroud. The house, Margaret, he said, his voice now a matter-of-fact baritone, as if he were discussing a business deal. I believe we should sell it and split the proceeds. We're both getting on in years. The maintenance is becoming too much of a burden. The cold, ruthless pragmatism of his words jolted me from my stupor. He was not just leaving me, he was taking our home, the very heart of our life together. The home that I had made, that I had nurtured, that had sheltered our family from the storms of life. And he was doing it for a woman who was young enough to be our granddaughter. I sat at the kitchen table as he spoke, his voice a distant hum, my mind a swirling maelstrom of thoughts and emotions. This was not just a betrayal, it was a profound, soul-crushing violation of a lifetime of trust and unspoken promises. I was not just being replaced, I was being erased, rendered obsolete, a thing to be discarded and forgotten. But as the shock began to recede, a cold, hard resolve began to form within me. I was not a discardable object. I was Margaret. I was a woman who had weathered many storms. I was a woman who was no stranger to sacrifice, to hard work, to fighting for what was hers. And this house, this quiet, unassuming colonial, was most certainly mine. That night, as Robert packed his things with a shocking lack of ceremony, a plan began to crystallize in my mind. A plan not born of fleeting fury or a desire for a dramatic public spectacle, but a plan rooted in a deep, cold, and calculated resolve. He believed he had taken everything from me. He believed he had all the power. He believed he could, with the simple words, "I am leaving you," erase my past, my present, and my future. He, in his arrogant blindness, had no idea that I still held the deed to my home, my family, and my dignity. He had no idea that I, in my quiet way, was still the engineer, the strategist, the one who held the blueprint to our lives. And I was about to redraw the entire plan. I watched him go, a man who once was my whole world, now a stranger departing with a suitcase full of clothes and a heart full of lies. He left a note on the kitchen counter, a neatly folded piece of paper with a sum he had calculated for my share of the house. I picked it up and crumpled it in my fist. He, the architect of his own betrayal, had no idea that I was about to become the architect of a new future. A future for myself. A future that did not involve him or his youthful muse, or the house that had been the unwitting witness to their cruel, public humiliation of me. The first move had been made, but the game, I knew, was far from over, and I was about to play my winning hand. The silence that descended upon the house after Robert's departure was not a comfortable one. It was a vacuum, a hollow echo of a life that was, but was no more. In that silence, I found a strange kind of clarity. A bitter, stinging clarity that cut through the fog of my grief and exposed the stark, brutal truth of my situation. I had been so quiet for so long, so compliant, so willing to be the woman in the background, that I had become a ghost in my own life. I had become so accustomed to his presence that I had forgotten what it was to be alone, to make my own decisions, to chart my own course. Now, with Robert gone, I was faced with a profound, terrifying emptiness. But with that emptiness came an equally profound and equally terrifying sense of freedom. The chains of a lifetime of expectations had been broken, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was Margaret, a woman unburdened by a man's whims. The first call came a week later. It was Clarissa. I had never spoken to her before, but her voice on the phone, a high-pitched, saccharine melody, was unmistakable. "Margaret," she chirped, a false cheerfulness to her tone. "It's Clarissa. We're just calling to check in. Robert told me about the house. He said you were a little upset, but that you were being so understanding. He told me you said you would accept his offer." Her words, dripping with condescension, felt like a slap in the face. Understanding? I was not understanding. I was calculating. I was planning. "My husband's offer?" I asked, my voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Clarissa, I am not a person to be discussed in the past tense. I am not a problem to be solved. And the house is not something to be divided like a piece of cake. It is my home." She was silent for a moment, clearly taken aback by my unyielding response. "He said you were so amicable," she stammered, a note of genuine confusion in her voice. "He said you were going to be reasonable." Reasonable. The word hung in the air like a taunt. I had been reasonable for 40 years. Now it was time for me to be firm. Over the next few weeks, the calls came with a disquieting regularity. From Robert, from Clarissa, from our son, Daniel, who had somehow become a pawn in their cruel, public game. Robert's voice was now tinged with an unfamiliar impatience, a frustrated edge I had never heard before. He had expected me to fold, to surrender, to accept his paltry offer with the quiet dignity of a woman whose time had passed. He had expected me to be the old Margaret, the compliant, silent partner. He had expected me to be, in essence, a non-person. But I was not. I was a woman with a plan. I began my quiet campaign of retribution. The first step was to change the locks on the front door. I had the locksmith come one Tuesday morning, a day Robert had always been at his office. The small click of the new lock, the smooth glide of the key, was a sound of profound liberation. I was a woman who was now a sovereign in her own kingdom. I was no longer an open door, a willing sacrifice, a shadow in her own home. The house was now truly, profoundly, and irrevocably mine. Then came the financial part. For all his grand pronouncements and bold ideas, Robert had always been a man of a certain fiscal naivety. He was a spender, not a saver, a visionary, not a pragmatist. I, on the other hand, was the rock. I had a separate bank account, one that he had dismissed as my little fun money, where I had quietly, meticulously saved a portion of his income for a future that I had always believed would be our own. Now, that future belonged to me alone. The funds were not vast, but they were substantial. It was a secret, a quiet act of foresight I had practiced for decades, a safety net I had woven for a future that I had never imagined would be so solitary. Now, that safety net was my weapon. I met with my lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a man who had handled our affairs for years, a man who had seen the rise and fall of countless couples, and a man who, in his quiet way, was a connoisseur of human weakness. He listened to my story without a word, his face a mask of professional impassivity. "He has no claim to the house, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice a calm, reassuring baritone. "The deed is in your name alone. He signed a quitclaim deed to you years ago when he was building his firm and took out a personal line of credit. He needed to show that the house was not part of his assets. It's a solid, legally binding document." My heart leaped with a triumphant surge of vindication. Robert, the architect, the man who prided himself on his meticulous attention to detail, had made the most crucial oversight of his life. In his desperate need for capital, he had signed away his claim to our home, a move he had probably forgotten in the long years that followed. Mr. Thompson, in his quiet, methodical way, began to lay out a plan of action. "We can issue a notice to vacate, Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Given that the house is now a legal matter, they have no claim to residency. I can also send a cease and desist letter regarding their continued attempts at communication. We can, in essence, make ourselves invisible to them." The word invisible, which had once been a source of my pain, was now a powerful tool. I was now in the position to turn the tables, to become the silent force, the one who held all the cards. When Daniel called a few days later, His voice was now full of a new, unsettling urgency. "Mom," he said, his voice a frantic whisper. "Dad told me that you're refusing to sell the house. What's going on? He said you're being so irrational. He said you're making this impossible." Irrational. Impossible. The words stung, but I stood my ground. "Daniel," I said, my voice as calm and unyielding as a stone. "I am not being irrational. I am being firm. This is my home. It always has been." He stammered, clearly thrown by my newfound resolve. "But Mom, he needs the money. Clarissa needs the money. They need to start a new life. And they need it from our house." The audacity of his words, the casual cruelty of his request, struck me with the force of a physical blow. He was not on my side. He was not a son fighting for his mother. He was, in essence, a co-conspirator, a passive accomplice to his father's betrayal. I hung up the phone without another word. The conversation was over. The game, however, had only just begun. I was no longer a woman in a vacuum. I was a woman with a purpose. My quiet, unassuming life had been shattered, but in its place a new, stronger resolve had been forged. He had left me for a younger woman. He had tried to take my home. He had enlisted my own son in his cruel, self-serving betrayal. He had no idea that I, in my quiet way, was about to become the architect of my own revenge. The silence in the house was no longer a vacuum. It was a canvas, and I was about to begin painting. The quiet campaign of retribution had officially begun, and I, in my unassuming way, was becoming a master strategist. The first sign of my new resolve was a small one, a quiet but firm act of defiance. One Sunday morning, as I watched Robert and Clarissa's social media accounts from the privacy of my laptop, I saw a photograph of them on a yacht, basking in the sun, surrounded by a group of smiling, elegant people. "Our golden years," the caption read, a cruel and heartless mockery of a phrase that had once been a shared promise between Robert and me. A profound, bone-deep fury rose within me. They were living the life he had promised me, the life I had quietly, meticulously saved for, a life I had imagined would be ours. The outrage was a physical sensation, a burning fire in my chest that had nothing to do with grief or sadness. It was the white-hot, cleansing fire of pure, righteous anger. I had a choice to make in that moment. I could either sit in my pain, a quiet, forgotten widow in her own home, or I could use this pain as fuel. I chose the latter. I made an appointment with a real estate agent, a quiet, efficient woman named Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, in her no-nonsense way, was the perfect accomplice for my quiet campaign. She did not ask about my personal life. She did not express sympathy or pity. She simply looked at the house, her eyes assessing, her face a mask of professional detachment. "It's a charming home, Mrs. Hayes," she said, her voice a calm, businesslike tone. "It's in a highly desirable neighborhood. We can sell this for a significant price." I nodded, my mind already racing with possibilities. "I'm not in a hurry," I said, a faint smile on my lips. "I want the right buyer. Someone who appreciates its history, its character." My words were a feigned sentiment, a smokescreen. The real goal was far more ruthless. The house was put on the market a week later. Robert and Clarissa, in their arrogant blindness, were completely unaware. They were too busy living their grand, extravagant life, a life they had built on the wreckage of mine. They were too preoccupied with their own happiness to notice that a quiet, unassuming old woman was redrawing the blueprints of their future. They were, in essence, dancing on my grave while I was quietly digging their own. My next step was to change my phone number. I had no desire to speak to them again. I had no need for their lies, their feigned concerns, their condescending attempts to manipulate me with empty promises and hollow words. The act of changing my number was a profound act of self-preservation. It was a way of declaring, to myself and to them, that the conversation was over. The line was now permanently disconnected. But the most significant step was yet to come. It was a step born of a quiet but profound resolve, a step that would, I knew, forever alter the course of their lives. It was an act of quiet, dignified revenge, a move so unexpected, so ruthless in its execution, that they would never see it coming. I had meticulously, painstakingly, and with a quiet satisfaction, begun the process of selling the house. The house, with its meticulously trimmed lawn, its peeling back porch railing, and the rose bushes I had nurtured for decades, was the central piece of my quiet plan. It was the only asset Robert truly cared about. It was the one thing he had fought for, the one thing he had demanded be sold. But he, in his arrogance, had no idea that I, in my quiet way, had not only secured it for myself, but had also become the master of its fate. He had no idea that I, in my quiet way, was about to become the architect of his demise. The calls from Robert had stopped completely. The emails, initially filled with condescending offers and veiled threats, had now dwindled to a single, angry message. "Margaret," it read, "you are being an ungrateful, vindictive woman. You are a spiteful, bitter person. This is not the woman I married." I read the message, my face a blank mask of impassivity, and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret. Only the quiet, cold satisfaction of a woman who had, in her quiet way, been vindicated. He, in his cruelty, had tried to make me small. But I was not small. I was a force of nature. The offer on the house came a week later. It was a young couple, a pair of first-time homebuyers who had fallen in love with its charm, its quiet street, its meticulously trimmed lawn. They, in their sweet innocence, saw not the ghosts of a broken marriage, but the promise of a future. They saw not the pain, but the potential. And I, in my quiet way, was happy for them. The house, I knew, would be in good hands. The offer was a significant one, far more than Robert had ever imagined. It was an offer that would, I knew, be the final, most devastating nail in the coffin of his arrogance. That night, as the sun set over the quiet, tree-lined street, I sat on my porch swing, a glass of water in my hand. The house, with its warm, welcoming glow, was no longer a sanctuary of my past. It was now a monument to my future. A future that did not involve him, or his youthful muse, or the condescending pity of my distant son. A future that was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely my own. The final piece of my quiet plan was about to be put into motion. It was a plan that was not about a dramatic public spectacle or a public shaming. It was a plan that was about a single, simple, and utterly final act of defiance. It was a plan that would, I knew, leave them both, in their arrogance and their blindness, with absolutely nothing. And it was a plan that would, I knew, bring me a profound and lasting peace. The signing of the papers, the single signature that would forever alter the course of their lives, was a quiet, unassuming affair. It was a Tuesday morning, the air still crisp and cool with the promise of autumn. I sat at a polished mahogany table in Mr. Thompson's office, a new, meticulously sharpened pen in my hand. The document before me was a simple, legal one, a final, unyielding testament to my quiet resolve. I was selling the house. The house that had been the unwitting witness to a lifetime of love and a profound, soul-crushing betrayal. Mr. Thompson, in his methodical way, explained the final details. "The funds from the sale will be transferred to your personal account, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice a calm, reassuring baritone. "The new owners will take possession in 30 days. We will notify Mr. Hayes and Clarissa via certified letter in accordance with the law. They will have no grounds for appeal." He pushed the document toward me, a small, knowing smile on his face. "This, Mrs. Hayes, is the final act. It's done." I took a deep, steadying breath and looked at the signature line. The paper, in my hand, was a simple thing, but its power was immense. It was the power of a woman who had, in her quiet way, taken back her life. I signed my name, my hand steady, my heart a calm, unyielding metronome. I then went to my son's house, a small, unassuming ranch in the suburbs. I did not call ahead. I did not announce my arrival. I simply drove to his home and rang the doorbell. Daniel, in his usual harried state, opened the door, a look of surprise on his face. "Mom," he stammered, a note of genuine confusion in his voice. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Pittsburgh." He had no idea. He had no idea that I, in my quiet way, had just orchestrated a life-altering act of retribution. I stepped inside without a word. The house, with its screaming children and a living room filled with a profound, chaotic mess, was a world away from the quiet, dignified stillness of my home. "I have something for you, Daniel," I said, my voice as calm and unyielding as a stone. I pulled a manila envelope from my purse and handed it to him. He opened it, his face a mask of bewilderment, and pulled out a single, perfectly folded piece of paper. It was a copy of the deed to my home, the final, legally binding document. My home. The home I had just sold. His face, as he read the document, turned a ghastly, ashen white. He looked at me, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. "Mom," he whispered, "you sold the house? Without telling us? Without telling Dad?" His voice, a frantic, high-pitched squeak, was a sound of a man in utter disbelief. "I had to, Daniel," I said, a strange, profound sadness in my voice. "It was the only way. You and your father, in your arrogance, in your cruelty, you left me with no other choice." He stammered, a desperate, pathetic attempt at a rebuttal. "But Mom, we could have helped you. We could have taken care of you." I scoffed, a dry, bitter laugh that sounded alien to my own ears. "Taken care of me?" I asked, a profound, soul-crushing sadness in my voice. "You didn't take care of me when you called me irrational, when you told me I was a burden, when you conspired with a man and a woman who were trying to steal my home. You, my own son, did not take care of me." I turned and walked away. The conversation was over. The game, however, was about to reach its final and most devastating conclusion. I was no longer a woman in a vacuum. I was a woman with a purpose. I had not just sold my home. I had, in my quiet way, sold the one thing they had so callously tried to take from me. I had, in my quiet way, declared that my life, my future, and my dignity were not for sale. The final act was a silent one. It was a cold, unforgiving Saturday morning, the kind of day that seemed to mirror the emotional landscape of my life. I was sitting at a local coffee shop, a warm cup of herbal tea in my hands, when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered it anyway. It was Robert, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper. "Margaret," he stammered, his voice filled with a profound, bone-deep panic. "What have you done?" "The sheriff came to the apartment. He served us with a notice to vacate. They said you sold the house. They said we have 30 days to get out." His voice, a thin, pathetic sound of a man in a state of utter collapse, was a profound, soul-crushing triumph. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. "The house, Robert," I said, my voice calm, flat, and devoid of any emotion. "It was never yours. It was always mine. You, in your arrogance, in your cruelty, in your profound, soul-crushing betrayal, you signed away your claim years ago. You just forgot." He was silent for a moment, a deafening, profound silence that spoke of a man in a state of utter, unyielding shock. "But Margaret," he stammered, "the money. We were counting on the money. We have nothing. We have nowhere to go." The words, a pathetic, desperate plea, brought me no joy. No. Instead, they brought me a profound, bone-deep sense of vindication. "I know, Robert," I said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on my lips. "I know." The conversation was over. The game, however, had reached its final and most devastating conclusion. He, in his arrogance, had no idea that I, in my quiet way, had just orchestrated a life-altering act of retribution. He had no idea that I, in my quiet way, had just rendered him and his youthful muse homeless. My story didn't end with a public spectacle. It ended in a quiet, unassuming coffee shop, with a cup of herbal tea in my hand, and a profound, bone-deep sense of peace. He had left me for a younger woman. He had tried to take my home. He had no idea that I, in my quiet way, had just taken everything from him. The final act was a silent one, but its power was immense. It was the power of a woman who had, in her quiet way, taken back her life. My peace, I knew, was not just a fleeting emotion. It was a profound, unyielding truth. And it was, I knew, a victory.